Hello everybody. What you're about to see is a talk I gave to the Cambridge Society of Economic Pluralism about behavioural science. It's called What the Hell is Behavioural Science? Now, I don't talk that much about behavioural science or behavioural economics on my channels, which is weird because that's my professional background. But here are some of my thoughts on what the discipline actually is, what it means, where it's going. The main reason I'm recording this preamble, though, is to give you a heads up that yes, the audio is clipping on the mic. Quite clearly, it's too loud and a bit too close to my mouth. Going and filming a lecture on location is something that's actually a bit new for me, so I made this mistake, but I thought it wasn't unbearable, so it's still worth uploading. Another thing is that in the tradition of all Canon cameras, this one is clipping every 15 minutes or so. It shouldn't make me incomprehensible. It's just a slight split second. But there's nothing I can do about it, and also nothing's wrong with your computer if you see it. So anyway, please enjoy.
I wanted to explain to you what behavioural science is, right? Or at least my perspective on what behavioural science is and could be. Because it's probably a term that we've started to see more and more. It's probably something you've heard of. Does anybody actually study behavioural science specifically here? No, okay. But that's good, right? Because this is going to be quite basic and it's going to build things up, and hopefully you'll just have a better idea of what this discipline is, if it's a real discipline, and what it's all about. So you might be wondering who I am to talk to you about such a thing. As I said, Tommy's kind of filled in pretty much everything that I was going to say. But the basic point here is that I did my undergraduate, master's, PhD in economics. Over the course of the degree, I became interested in behavioural economics because I felt like the very rational model of behaviour didn't necessarily capture everything we're interested in. At the time, that was becoming more widely accepted, but it wasn't necessarily taught that widely. I think these days things are a little bit better. There are more modules on behavioural economics, and so I focused on reference points, which is just what people compare themselves to, right? And I tried to look at how that affects actual behaviour, looking at like household data sets, looking at savings, earnings, social mobility, how that's affected by reference points. Turns out, really, really difficult, doesn't necessarily work, depending on how you read the thesis. But you know, it's something that's really tricky, and it's a challenge for behavioural economics because there's so much going on in any data set, in any one decision. Teasing out exactly what's affecting it is really, really tough, right? And the very best papers from the field, you know, they're sort of written by four full professors who are all from MIT, and it took them like 10 years to do it. So like, it's just really tough. But anyway, so I moved from behavioural economics into behavioural science when I joined LSE. And, you know, behavioural economics and behavioural science, you could be forgiven for thinking they're the same thing. I don't think they are. I think behavioural economics is much more mathematical. And what I did at LSE was I was teaching on an executive master's program, which is basically a master's program for rich people as far as I could tell. And we were very focused on like applications and trying to improve behavior within people's organizations and things like that. And so I think it's much more holistic behavioral science, right? Whereas economics is very focused on modeling and statistics, behavioral science is a little bit more holistic. And I'm not like technically employed by them anymore, but I'm still a visiting fellow, which means different things to different people. As far as I can tell, it just means I get to use the LSE email. I haven't got around to asking me to do anything in return yet, so I'm just staying quiet so that they don't. So one way of approaching this question, what the hell is behavioural science, is to say, well, let's take a historical perspective. How did it emerge? And, you know, you can go back as far as you like and, you know, depending on how pretentious you're feeling, and reference all the classical thinkers. My friend, I was on holiday with my friend the other day, and he was reading Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and I picked it up and had a look, and I was like, so this is kind of behavioural science, you know, how to think about the present and the future, how to think about other people and so on, and well-being and happiness and all that kind of stuff. So my colleague Liam Delaney, who maybe you might want to invite one day, can give you like literally the long arc history of behavioural science with like, you know, everything anyone's ever said that vaguely is like behavioural science stretching back as long as you like. But really, the modern discipline, to fast forward quite a lot, the modern discipline emerged, you know, just in the 2000s and even the 2010s. Before I started my like undergraduate degree, I hadn't really heard the term. And it wasn't until the 2010s that it kind of consolidated into being like a separate thing. That's when you started to see these courses, like in behavioural science, you started to see these conferences, right? And you started to see departments actually call themselves behavioural science departments. And you started to see journals that were behavioural science journals. So at first glance, and I hinted at this in the last slide, I'd say it's quite interdisciplinary, behavioural science, more so than any other discipline really, certainly more so than economics. Everyone knows that economists can be quite narrow, they can be quite trapped in their own ideas, they don't necessarily pay as much attention to other disciplines as they should, but really everyone's kind of in their silos. And as this discipline emerged, you had a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds in it and using very, very different approaches to look at behaviour. But I think really the main thing was psychology crossed with economics. This was the thing. So there were biologists and neuroscientists in LSE and in other behavioural science departments, but really it was this crossover, kind of a clash, kind of a consolidation between psychology and economics. And I think, you know, this is broad strokes, but if you think about the different approaches, well, you've got psychology. Now, psychologists are very interested in all of the depths of human behavior and people and attitudes and beliefs and motivations and everything, you know, from your upbringing, how that affects you. They like to go into a lot of depth. They like to really, really understand behavior. Now, that's great, but one thing that psychologists have been accused of is, well, you know, you've got all these theories, you've got 1,001 different ideas about why somebody's doing something. So which one is it, right, in this situation? Sometimes it's a kind of bag of tricks psychology, and it's like it doesn't necessarily have clear prediction and application. Economists, much more parsimonious. As we know, they kind of like the rational model. They kind of like to mathematize things and make predictions. There are a lot of limitations of that model, but there are also quite a lot of things it explains in the data. And one of the things I actually developed ironically in my PhD was a bit of a renewed appreciation for like how much the rational model can explain with so little. But of course, we know that people aren't rational, especially in the sense suggested by that like core economic model, which basically means godlike. It means I know everything that's going to happen, and I plan accordingly, right? So psychologists brought this kind of realistic approach to human behavior that was maybe missing from this quite abstract economic model. But economists tried to, you know, bring a little bit more parsimony, a little bit more rigor, try and be a bit more focused on prediction. So I think that's like one of the first things. It kind of emerged from this combination of disciplines, and it was like an interdisciplinary approach to behavior. And I should say that another feature of behavioral science is that although it's more holistic than economics, it is still very quantitative. Generally speaking, you're talking like statistical findings and stuff. So this is one explanation, and it's fine. It's absolutely fine to say behavioral science emerged in this way, but it's not entirely satisfactory. There's a little bit of a tautology here in the sense that I'm just like describing to you what happened, and like if it had happened differently, would behavioral science be different? Surely we want a kind of definition of behavioral science that's kind of independent of the specific historical circumstances in which it emerged, right? So you know, it's okay. It's a working definition. Now, another way to define behavioral science might just be to look at big ideas, right? And so you might have heard of some of these. What are the main ideas in behavioral science? Heuristics and biases, right? You mentioned heuristics and biases. So it's pretty well established that this is how humans make decisions, using heuristics, using rules of thumb. A good example of a heuristic is that we often sort of copy people around us, right? You know, when people were arriving at this room, they probably like looked into the other room and they were like, why is everyone there? Surely that tells me something, right? There's something going on here. And that's true. It did tell you something because this room was locked, right? So heuristics are fine. They work quite well a lot of the time. But of course, sometimes they can lead to problems. Following the crowd doesn't always work. Like if you shout fire in a crowded theatre, right, and everybody herds, and that doesn't lead to good things. So heuristics, rules of thumb, work pretty well sometimes, but most of the time, but sometimes they lead to biases. They lead to errors in decision making, right? And so this relates to, but is distinct from this system 1 and system 2 thinking. So there was made famous, this idea by like Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which was a best-selling book. And system 1 is the kind of unconscious, reflexive, way you think, whether you're following social norms, following people around you, or even something like walking right. You're not thinking like, oh, now I'm going to raise my right leg and I'm going to like, flex this quad, and then, you just do it instinctively. And that applies to most behavior. With system 2 thinking, it's often a lot slower. It's often a lot more systematic, right? And so like doing coursework is a really obvious example of system 2 thinking. And people don't really like system 2 thinking, which is why coursework is so painful, right? So this is a kind of taxonomy. It's quite a simple taxonomy that has really influenced behavioral science, the thinking of behavioral scientists. And in system 1, obviously, you're much more likely to be using heuristics, right? In system 2, you're much less likely to be using heuristics, or you're using them, to a lesser extent. So this all relates to, if you haven't heard of any behavioral science idea, or if you've only heard of one behavioral science idea, it's probably this one, right? Nudging, right? So nudging is about trying to change behavior, trying to use these heuristics and biases, trying to understand how people behave, where they make mistakes, where heuristics lead to biases, and therefore changing their environment in order to create better outcomes and create better behaviors. So a pretty standard example would be like what's next to the till in a shop or in a cafeteria or something like that. It's pretty well established that people are going to buy what's next to the till. So what do you put there? Do you put like sweets, or do you put like fruit? And that's been used in like school cafeterias, right, to try and encourage children to eat fruit instead of having, chips there or sweets or whatever. A fourth one, which is a little bit different, or seems a little bit different, is well-being. So well-being research is about happiness, how well off people are, how they rate their own happiness. Typically it's subjective well-being. How did you feel yesterday is a really common one for kind of in-the-moment mood. There's also how satisfied are you with your life overall. There's all of these kind of subjective questions that we ask people. And most behavioral scientists, including myself, have done some research on well-being. Think about why that is, because at first it seems like it's slightly different to these. But I think what brings them together is that with behavioral science and behavioral economics and psychology, we say we're looking at actual behaviors. People sometimes say that. We're looking at how humans actually behave. It's a little bit self-important, I think, but it is right. And I think with this, you're looking at what actually makes people happy, right? So you're trying to investigate that. And certainly, if you have a sort of rational model, are there any of you who've done like revealed preference and all that, right? Then you don't need to ask this question, because people's choices reveal their preferences. So if you're looking at well-being and welfare, you're just inferring it from their choices. This person chose to buy this thing, therefore that made them happy, right? You don't need to ask them how happy they are. It's answered by the choices. Once you start saying, well, choices are pretty messy, they might not necessarily reflect what they really want, then you have to find other ways to look at happiness, which I think is one of the things that leads to this well-being. But often if you look at a behavioral science conference or center, it will be like a behavioral science and well-being center, right? So they're typically combined. So this is the second way of defining it, right? This is the second way of defining it. And again, it's okay, but it still has this kind of, okay, these are just the ideas that we've come up with so far, right? And again, I think that, we could see that all of these things are refuted in the future, right? And then it would no longer be a satisfactory definition of behavioral science. Maybe nudge doesn't work. We'll talk about that. There's critics of system 1 and system 2 theory. It's called dual process theory sometimes. So there are lots of reasons that this could end up being not representative of behavioral science in the future, which means that it's not that good a definition. So for the third example, I want to delve into nudge a little bit more, because I do think it's really worth talking about in depth. And the reason I think nudge is worth talking about in depth actually stems from my experience of teaching on the executive master's program, because so executive masters, they have jobs, they're executives, and they typically want to use behavioral science to improve their organization. Now that could be a lot of things. It could be that they work in government and it's like policy and they want to improve health outcomes. But they could work in the private sector, right? And they want to improve safety behavior, or they want to influence or understand customer behavior. They could be in an NGO. It could be about charity, how to elicit charity donations. It could be a really wide range of things. But they're very focused, I find, on nudge and on practical applications. So it's worth talking about these in a little more depth. Now, with nudge, I think this is packed up. So nudge is really about small changes to choice environments. Putting fruit next to the till. A really big nudge, or a really prominent nudge, I should say, is like a default, right? So if you default people into a savings program, they will tend to save more. If they're automatically saving for their pension from their earnings, they will tend to save more, even if they have the option to. Is that working now? Thank you. No, it's not. Well, I don't know what's going on. Oh, it's fine. Even if they have the option to opt out, they can opt out, right? So that's the idea. People opt out, and people are automatically saving for their pension. So that's had quite a lot of impact. But since nudge was published, the first one was published in 2008, and even in the original nudge book, you can see this. It's clear that this can't solve every problem, right? You're not going to solve every problem. One of their examples is putting fake flies on the urinal to stop men from weeing everywhere. It's a bit cute, isn't it? Also, they say that there was an experiment and it reduced spillage by 80%, and I'm like, who did that? Where did that come from? I don't believe you. All of this stuff is a little bit cute. So you sometimes need bigger things, right? Now, then there's this budge, which is a bigger change. The sugar tax in the UK was a budge. It was really heavily informed by behavioural scientists. So in 2016, they introduced these taxes that are progressive in terms of sugar content. The idea was, first, you increase the price of the more sugary drinks. Second, you incentivize the companies just to put less sugar in their drinks in the first place, right? And so this is a really big shift to behavior, and it's not like a small change to your choice environment that preserves your freedom of choice or anything like that. It's it has a big impact. They completely changed Lucozade in response to this. So there was no getting away from it. You can't buy the old version of Lucozade anymore. You can only buy the new, really gross one, right? So this is when you need more. Then there's a shove, which is even bigger. You're talking about bans, right? You're talking about proper regulatory changes and things like that. These are really big changes. Then there's there are a lot of these. I've actually only done 6, but there are quite a few. Arguably, there are too many. So boost is actually a really interesting one. So there's this critique of nudge, which is that despite trying to just make small tweaks and preserve freedom of choice, it's still a little bit paternalistic because it assumes people are making the wrong decisions and that you can decide what outcome they should actually be pursuing, right? So there's this behavioural scientist who I really like called Gerge Gorenza, who says, look, we're kind of obviously we're not fully rational creatures. We're imperfect. We make some bad decisions, and we can be quite bad at processing information. But if you change how the information is presented, right, then you can really improve things. Now, a good example is like probabilities. People are really bad at processing probabilities. If you ask like doctors questions about like false positives and false negatives in a test, how many people are going to end up having this disease, they get it wrong. If you switch to frequencies though, as in 1 in 100 instead of 0.01, people do much better. Something to do with frequencies are kind of how we encounter things, in our actual lives. Probabilities are a bit more abstract. So he's saying, we can improve people's decisions, but give them the information in the right way, in the proper way, right? So boost is an alternative. There's sludge, which is, there's sludge, which is kind of the opposite of nudge. And this is actually one of the more useful ones as well, I think. It's basically a bad nudge. So what about if your choice environment was just like not helping you make a decision? What about if it was actually making things worse? And a good example of that is just like if you fill out like insurance forms, right? Insurance forms, health insurance like in the US, or car insurance or anything, they're typically, very long, very confusing. There's so much room for error. And, it's because the insurance company benefits from, first, you not really wanting to do it. Second, if you don't do it properly, then you might not get your claim, right? And so there's this idea of like sludge audits, which was invented by Sunstein, the co-author of Nudge. Where is he? There. So that's like kind of going through these things and just trying to make sure that people's decisions aren't like actively impaired by certain actors, whether it's like private companies or governments or other people or whatever. And then there's a fudge, which is simply a nudge that doesn't work. So there you go. Now, this is our third working definition before we move on a little bit. So this is a completely fair impression of behavioural science. And I do think when I say behavioural science to people, they say nudge. And then there's all these derivative ones which kind of broaden it. They're a little bit annoying, again, like with all the silly names and stuff. And some of them are also names for things that already exist, like, bands already exist. So I don't know why you have to call them shoves, but that's all putting it into this taxonomy. But I really think a problem, and this really comes from my teaching, the executives, they're so laser focused on finding a nudge, like it's a silver bullet, and finding an application, and they're like, I'm going to solve this problem, and it's just plug and play. I'm just going to use a default in this situation. I'm just going to, use a social norm intervention to encourage people to do something. And it's way too little time exploring the behavioral science behind it. There's so much behavioral science behind it that isn't just focused on, can I nudge this person in this situation, right? And I think it leads to quite a shallow approach where you just end up doing a load of things that don't work because you're not really understanding why things work and when they do work and when they don't work. So that's something that I've experienced, and I really had to try and beat it out of them over the course of the master's degree with limited success, because it's literally the only question they ask is what nudge can I use in this situation? But I just don't think it captures something which the earlier definitions probably captured a little bit better, which was how holistic behavioral science is and how interdisciplinary it is, and the well-being angle and all these other things, right? So we have the sort of historical working definition, how it emerged, who comprises it. We have the main ideas that we've seen. And then we have this specific nudge/application focus. All of them are fine. All of them are pretty accurate in terms of what behavioral science is, but I don't find any of them entirely satisfactory. So just to give you an idea of what I do, and I think this kind of gets to this point that nudges are too narrow, and you mentioned some of these, Tommy. But so one of my papers was about the well-being of parents. Turns out if you have 3 children of the same sex, you will experience a decrease in happiness for about 10 years compared to people who have 2 of one sex and then the opposite one. I think my co-author got the idea when he was like on the train just looking at a family with 5 boys. And he was like, you didn't want 5 boys, did you? You kept having children because you thought you were going to have a girl as well, right? So anyway, that was like, yeah, it turns out, bit of an impact. It does dissipate, but yeah. Then there's my paper on sludge. So despite complaining about it, I have written a paper on it. And this is about brown sludge, which is specifically about impediments to pro-environmental behaviours. And there's lots of different levels to this, but you know, how confusing recycling is a quite good example of like something that could be nudged. A lot of people don't know what they're supposed to recycle and like where to put it. But the paper also goes a bit further and it says, okay, well, you've got these kind of individual things, but the fact that most recycling is actually just like taken to the dump anyway, regardless of whether you put the right thing in it or not, that's not something you can nudge, right? That's a way bigger systemic issue. So there's different levels to this, which is why it's called sticky brown sludge everywhere, because there's just so many impediments to pro-environmental behaviour. And finally, the one that we're kind of trying to get published at the moment, although it just got resoundingly rejected, is this experiment on charitable giving. So basically we ask on websites, charity websites, does having more options lead to more donations or to fewer donations? And somewhat surprisingly, has anyone heard of choice overload or the paradox of choice? So the result, we thought it would be choice overload. We thought more options, fewer donations. Turns out it's the opposite. More options leads to more donations. Maybe because it makes people think a little bit more about what they're doing. We kind of offer that explanation. So, you know, this is like, you can relate some of this to like the practical applications, but really, I think this is like way beyond that. So we need to like try and capture all of this with our definition, I think. Yes, so that's all very nice. But wait, what if behavioural science is actually just a load of bollocks? Because you may have heard of some of this, particularly these last two, who are a bit recent. So from left to right, we've got Brian Wansink, Francesco Gino, and then Dan Ariely. Now, Brian Wansink is a nutritionist, dietary researcher. Was doing these kind of behavioural science interventions. One of them was, what was it, the bottomless bowl. So if you keep refilling someone's bowl, they'll just keep eating, apparently. There were also other ones like many more when there's like an attractive woman present, or I don't know. This era of psychology is always a little bit creepy and weird in hindsight, but there's lots of stuff about that. Dan Ariely made people masturbate in one of his experiments as well, right? And this was like only 10 years ago, really, some weird stuff going on. So yeah, I don't know. It was like, it definitely, I think he was suspended for a year after doing that because it violated obvious ethical codes. So Brian Wansink, around 2011, people look at his data, looks pretty dodgy. Some of it might be fabricated. Certainly, he's engaged in a process called p-hacking, which many of you may have heard of, where you basically, you know, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess, is the saying, right? So it's like, just run enough analysis, something comes out. Oh, people keep eating food as if you keep refilling the bowl, right? But he did tell his assistants, he was like, find whatever you can in this data set. And then they come out with some fun story. And the newspapers loved it because it's all like such a good headline, right? All these quirky psychology findings. These guys are a little bit more recent. Now, they famously studied dishonesty, and they both, on a paper, this paper on dishonesty was about how if you sign your name on a pledge of honesty, you're more likely to be honest. And it was like an insurance thing. I think it was the number of miles you'd driven in a car that you were renting. And they reported that if you sign your name before you fill out the form, it increases honesty. Now, this was really big. A lot of countries tried to improve like tax compliance with it. A lot of countries found that it didn't work. Somebody looked at their data. Turns out they both independently, allegedly, faked data on the same paper without the other one knowing. So I mean, his spreadsheets are like all over the place. They're like, it just seems like they've like randomly generated numbers, and there are actually 3 groups in the experiment, like with one treatment, with another treatment, with a control, but then they got combined somehow into 2 groups. The font was different on like different cells. It was a bit funny. So they've been investigated, and I do think they kind of deny wrongdoing. But there was this whole outbreak, and outrage, and it was. Yeah, so it did a lot to damage the credibility of behavioural science, and these aren't the only people, but they are the most prominent ones. But I think this fraud, right? This kind of data manipulation is just one. It's the extreme end of a very large wedge, I think, because we've had the replication crisis. Again, this may well be something you've heard of, and in the 2010s, there was just this realization that a lot of the findings in psychology especially just couldn't be replicated. And again, it was kind of cutesy. A lot of it was very cute, right? Priming research. Do unconscious cues in the environment affect your behavior? If you make people read or spell out words that are associated with being elderly, like grey or wrinkly, do they then walk more slowly after the experiment, right? Power poses, you've probably heard of power poses, right? Like, does that make you perform better? Ego depletion, do we have like a fixed reservoir of decision-making capability per day? And even more, is that refilled by glucose? Because that was one of the things, it was kind of like, like if you eat a Mars bar, it was like the Snickers advert, right? Like if you eat a Snickers, then are you actually now better at decision-making, right? So no, or at least more research is needed is the charitable way of saying it. But look, a lot of this was just small sample sizes, right? One problem, 20 people, just not enough to make an inference. Undergraduate participants, there's nothing wrong with undergraduates, but like you are a small sample of the population, right? You're not necessarily representative. And of course, p-hacking, so just getting the data, then seeing what you can find. So as a counterpart, some researchers found that if you play When I'm 64, the Beatles song, to participants, then they actually age backwards by 1.5 years. So that just tells you about the kind of nonsense you can produce with dodgy statistics, right? Because obviously that is impossible. A lot of this was just, it was no good. It was just really, really terrible research, and it made headlines and it made some people kind of famous, but it just seems like there's not really that much evidence for any of it, right? And so we're trying to improve our practices. Nudges. Arguably the sort of flagship intervention. Do they work? Maybe not. So this Mertens paper, this review, found large effect sizes for nudges. It was only a few years ago in 2021, 440 effects. They found that nudges do tend to work. But Wansink and Ariely's fraudulent studies are in there. They're in the review. And they also don't adjust for publication bias, which, in case you don't know what that means or want a refresher, it just means that everything interesting is published, and if you find something uninteresting, statistically insignificant, right, no effect, you don't send it anywhere. Or if you do send it, they don't want it, right? So it's left in your file drawer. So you need to adjust for that, because there are a whole load of null findings that no one will ever see. And as a researcher, you do this all the time. You look at a data set, and it's not like you're kind of lying, but it's just if you just look at it and there's just nothing interesting there, you're like, well, I'll go and do something else, right? And so there's this whole problem, this like underbelly of unpublished findings, I think. Now, if you can fortunately adjust for this statistically. So Maier et al. Update this analysis, and they find that nudges on average don't work after you do this. So this is quite bad, I think, and it's worse than just like a couple of specific people being fraudulent and, lying about their data, or even individual instances of p-hacking. It's like the main intervention that behavioural scientists tout doesn't doesn't work on average. Now, there is a caveat which everybody absolutely agrees on, which is that like there are heterogeneities, right? So it's just a fancy word for different nudges might work. Some don't work, some backfire, some have null effect, right? And figuring out when that is obviously the difficult task. But like defaults, which I mentioned earlier, they're pretty robust, like they do tend to work, right? And some social norm interventions do work. So there are some out there, but you just have to be very careful. And I think this relates to the plug and play thing that I had with the execs. It's like, look, if they don't work on average, then don't think you can just come in, swoop into a situation with your favorite nudge and suddenly improve things, right? Because also there was this really depressing result, which I think I'd seen it before, but I only sort of thought about it or noticed it when I was just doing research for this talk, which is if you get people to predict the results of nudges, behavioural scientists don't do any better at predicting their effects than just like a member of the public. And actually in one study they did worse. So like, what do we know about behaviour? Yeah, I don't know. So the positives, let me mount a small defence of behavioural science for a bit. There are numerous interventions that have worked. And I said this, right, like with default interventions, but you know, having taught on behavioural science courses, we have lots of people from organisations, Kahneman, like former students, come and they've done things that have really, really worked. They're like, you know, hand washing wasn't working, but we designed this intervention and we've increased it to like 97% now, right? So it does work, right? It's just that there's no easy way of doing it. You have to know the context, you have to know the behavioural science very well. There's a lot being produced within behavioural science that I think is really worthwhile. So just recently, an example from one of my colleagues, Dario Kapan and Luke Schneider, they were investigating, they had this kind of reflective piece in Nature Human Behavior, investigating what the difference is between a decision and a behavior. And I think there's a lot of this exploration in behavioral science. I think it's really fruitful. I think if you do flip through, you know, behavioral public policy or something, you find a lot of interesting stuff. Things like sludge audits, which I mentioned earlier, I think are really, really fruitful. So there is a lot of very interesting stuff going on. I've kind of been a bit mean to behavioral science and nudge about being kind of cute and maybe a little bit obvious sometimes, but sometimes things are obvious in hindsight. And when you look at how a lot of organizations were approaching these issues before they introduced behavioral science, it was terrible. You know, with like GP appointments with the NHS, it was so difficult to cancel, and like you couldn't contact them. You had to like send a letter long after everyone stopped sending letters. And then the behavioral scientist updated it. Now you get a text 24 hours before saying, if you want to cancel, reply stop in capitals. It seems really trivial and obvious, but it actually saved quite a lot of GP's time. And, you know, it wasn't obvious because it wasn't being done, right? But there's just so much stuff like this where a lot of these approaches to behavior were really crude and terrible for a long time. So there's definitely been some market improvement there. I've already kind of mentioned this, but you know, being able to speak to a biologist, because as an economist, I don't know anything about biology, and I might just have some nonsense idea of like what biology is about in my head, and I might put a sort of pseudo biological explanation in my paper. Actually being able to consult a biologist and then be able to tell me I'm talking nonsense is a really good thing. Also learning about how other disciplines approach things, learning that even though they sometimes use different words, it might actually be quite similar to what you're doing. They have different presentation styles. I find that's been really, really fruitful. And just on a similar themes, right? But these degrees, right? They're you know, there's a lot of really, really interesting teaching being done at like LSE and Warwick and Cambridge as well. And a lot of these degrees are just teaching people about these things, and there wasn't really a space for it before. Now there is for learning about like human behavior specifically. And again, you know, I've kind of said that, creating journals. And also this, you know, re-replication crisis. there's been this massive growth, and behavioral scientists are really, they're very good at this. They're so aware of the replication crisis that now they're doing things like saying what they're going to do before they do it, so they can't tweak their hypotheses after the fact. Doing sample size calculations, so they have a sample size that's neither too big nor too small. Doing lots of robustness checks and sharing data, making that public. That has improved so much over the past 10 years, right? So that's quite a positive development, actual defense of behavioral science. But it's not actually an answer to the question I raised at the start. So, this is the penultimate slide. I want to talk to you a little bit about our core approach. Now, it's one thing to get your statistics right, not to lie about your data, not to manipulate your data, to engage in proper statistical practices. But I do think that the way behavioral science might move on in the future is to move away from this kind of biases idea. So, as I've described throughout this, right, we had the sort of rational model in economics. And then there was this biases approach that was like, well, wait a minute, there are lots of deviations from the rational model. Now, the Wikipedia page on biases, I think, has 200 entries, right? And it's very reminiscent of kind of periods in science where there were so many exceptions to the rule that it all became a bit convoluted, and actually what you needed was a new unifying theory. People often use the heliocentric model of the solar system, right? There were too many exceptions, they had to have the solar-centric one. And the evolutionary biologist Jason Collins has said that, you know, there aren't 200 human biases. There are 200 deviations from the wrong model, right? Having the rational model at the core and assuming that everything that doesn't adhere to it is a deviation is actually the problem here. So there's a really central theoretical problem, I think. Now, it makes sense with nudge, because if there's a bias, then you might want to correct it, right? It also coheres with the replication crisis, because every bias is like a quirk, and it's a nice study that you can publish and get the headlines and everything in the way that one Cinquenarielli did. Okay? So I think this approach kind of has maybe led us astray. Maybe it was necessary as a stage, but I think we need like better models at the heart of behavioral science. Let me give you this concrete example. So Collins talks about the gaze heuristic. Right. Now, this is a really, I find it really interesting. So, you may or may not know this. If you throw a ball, or someone throws a ball, and you go to catch it, you, humans, and also dogs, will angle your eyes at a certain angle and vary the speed of your run so that the angle stays constant. Then, hopefully, you end up where the ball lands at the moment the ball lands there. That is the idea. Works really well. What would be the kind of purely rational way? Well, it would be to do like some kind of calculation with Newton's laws or something, and like then go and stand where the ball's going to be. Obviously, even the smartest, most athletic person in the world isn't going to be able to do that, right? So this heuristic, as with so many heuristics, works pretty well. But also leads to some slight weird behaviors. People typically run in an arc to the point that they're they catch the ball, instead of a straight line, which would take slightly less leg power, right? Also, and you'll realize you do this now, if you throw a ball directly up in the air, people tend to sort of back away and then go back to where they were standing, right? Which is obviously a waste of energy, right? Now, if you were looking at this, and I'm just completely plagiarizing this from Collins, by the way, but if you were looking at this as a nudger, right, you would say, well, you know, this is like some kind of curve bias or something that we need to correct in the behavior. But the problem is, you know, if you correct the curve bias and you make people run in straight lines, well, then you're going to mess up their whole decision-making process. So you need to really work with how people behave and understand like heuristics. Now, Collins says two candidates, and maybe these haven't been included in behavioral science enough, are evolution and computer science for like models of human behavior that think about achieving specific goals. They're both quite algorithmic, like kind of focused on survival, kind of similar to what economists do as well. There's a coherence there for sure, but maybe slightly different. But that's one suggestion. for how we approach behaviour in a way that hopefully tries to cohere some of our observations and help us understand it a little bit better. So, what is behavioural science? So, with everything I've just said, and it is a lot, there is a focus on behaviour. We're very focused on behaviours in a way that a lot of other disciplines haven't been, as opposed to being perhaps focused on things like attitudes or personality, right? So it's very outcome oriented. How can we change these behaviours? Behaviours are something which is very observable, which is why we approach them from a scientific perspective. So things like randomized control trials, right? Using quantitative data and statistics, applications, trying to apply things out in the real world to improve them, better models like Jason Collins' evolutionary and computer science model, and other insights from science. So you may notice that I have simply, as my conclusion, I've just said the name of the discipline back at you. But I could have made this the first slide, but I think like it would have been less impactful, right? Because I think the whole process of everything, coming up with these ideas of human behavior, trying to improve our models, the replication crisis, people view it in a very negative light, but I think it was a very good thing because we weeded out all the really bad practices and now it's much better. And so really with behavioral science, I kind of see it as a question, right? And the answer may be no, right? Because it's so hard, as we've seen. Lots of things don't replicate. You have to be very sensitive to context. Something which works in one place and time may not work in another place and time. But I think through using all of these tools, the question is like, can we approach behavior from a scientific perspective, right? And that is the question that we're asking. So yeah, my final slide is just the monorail slide, but I just thought, yeah, in conclusion, behavioural equals behavioural and science equals science. There you go. That's it.